So welcome everyone to this meeting. And today's public lecture that is called Racial Capitalism in Canada, Lessons for the Environmental Justice Movement. I welcome all of you here and especially our guest and the excellent scholar and also cherished collaborator, Professor Dr. Sourayan Mookerjea of the University of Alberta in Edmonton. And he will give a talk today about racial capitalism in Canada. But before I introduce him and today's agenda, let me say a few words about tonight's event. I will share my screen for this bit. This event, I hope you can see the slide directly and not the, yes, okay, now I'm good. This event is part of a public lecture series that is called High-Tech Valorization of Nature, Reproduction, Technology and Politics in Green Capitalist Projects. And this lecture series is hosted by our research project Biomaterialities at the Humboldt University zu Berlin. Biomaterialities is a 5-year research project, and we're a team of 9 researchers ranging from master students like Till, who is helping today with the tech side of things. So thanks very much, Till, and ranging also to postdocs and our 2 PIs, Dr. Zara Hackford and Dr. Miriam Boyer. I am Anna Save. I'm a political economist and a postdoc at Biomaterialities, and I'll be hosting tonight. In our research group, in general, we are interested in society-nature relations and the ways they change in the bioeconomy, especially in the high-tech bioeconomy. And we focus on understanding the materiality of living nature and how it's valorized. And we seek to answer how production, reproduction, and politics are shaping the bioeconomy and how they are also shaped by it. So this is the context of tonight's event, or today's event, if you're joining from Canada like Sourayan. And for today's talk, which will be accompanied by a discussion, we invited you, Sourayan, to bring into dialogue our research on the bioeconomy with a key dynamic and structure of modern societies that is racial capitalism. We invited Professor Mookerjea as an expert on the topic and to learn from his work to better understand how the workings of societies and the powers within them engineer bioeconomy visions or co-engineer them. Let me say a few words about the bioeconomy for those who are new to the topic. The bioeconomy is an ambiguous and an amorphous thing. We understand the bioeconomy as a political project that claims to transform the material and energetic basis of an economy by using biogenic and bio-based resources instead of fossil ones. And this is a political project that is in the making in countries, among them Germany and Canada. Germany is where we're based, and Sourayan is based in Canada. And the nation states of Germany and Canada both have bioeconomy strategies, and they formulate goals such as the substitution of fossils as the base for the economy, or at least an increase of bio-based production. And while such strategies can be interpreted as a big win towards more sustainable economies, this envisioned societal transformation also comes with many inherent sustainability challenges. Open questions are, for example, where should the resources for this transition come from? Who produces them? Where should they go? Where should they be harvested? A main field of contestation in the Canadian context is forestry. Forests are a prime resource source for the bioeconomy transition, and boreal forests grow vastly in Canada. Professor Mookerjea will interrogate competing visions of social ecological transformations that also concern this resource space and also does concern the bioeconomy. But before I say too much at the start, let me move back to our guest tonight and also to the dialogue and the exchange that we want to facilitate today. For his talk, Sourayan will draw on a book that he's currently writing, which is called Interlocking Racisms, Multiple Colonialisms, Accumulated Violence, and Degrowth Plenitude. I believe one starting point for this monograph is the interlocking neocolonial systems of oppression that shape Canadian society and Canada's political economy. And he has observed those topics like racism, colonialism, and capitalism in Canada for years now. And the political strategies that aim to put Canadian society and its political economy on a more sustainable path, they must, or they should, reckon with these already present structures that Sourayan has investigated. But in practice, this is not yet completely figured into political strategies of a greener economy. So Sourayan will take us today into Canadian history and its political present, and he will illustrate two understandings of Green New Deal politics in Canada that are not alike, as we will find out. Let me introduce to you now Sourayan. He is a professor of sociology and a research director of the Intermedia Research Studio in the Department of Sociology in the University of Alberta in Treaty 6 territory. He specializes in quite some fields in intermedia research creation, in critical social theory, global sociology, political ecology, and energy humanities. And his research addresses the questions of, for example, ecological depth, of cultural class politics, of renewable energy system transformation, and he engages critically with ecofeminist degrowth theory and the delinking from world ecologies of racial capitalism and from the colonizers' model of the world. He's also a co-director of the project Feminist Energy Futures, as well as IDOC Intermediate Documentary, and he's a co-investigator of the research creation collaboration speculative energy future. So research creation, that's convergence of research and artistic practices. And in case you don't know that, for example, when you come from the German context, I really encourage you to check this out because I find this work fascinating. He's also a member of the Feminisms and Degrowth Alliance Writing Collective. This is where we know each other from and which has been super fruitful and inspiring to work with you in this collective. And also at the University of Alberta, he's an education coordinator for climate action. So this background and research is vast and rich, and it's really hard to illustrate everything he does. However, I found a really nice and thought-provoking quote by Sourayan that I wanted to share in the beginning, because I really think that it sets the scene for tonight's conversation. And this quote is taken from a description of a project on Intermedia Commons, and I will just read it because I thought it's very fitting. On a planet with unprecedented social inequality, enclosed and ruled by plutocrats and oligarchs, now in deep socio-ecological crises, the need to decolonize the social sciences has never been more urgent. Once you get beyond the colonizers' model of the world, what replies? That's a really important question to ask. And I believe he did already answer that with a poem, but this is really for you to check out if you really want to go into research creation, what else he does. So Sourayan, I'm so happy to welcome you here. I'm looking forward to the insights that you prepared for us, and looking forward to open up the conversation about how to connect our research on the bioeconomy with your research on racial capitalism. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thanks for that very generous introduction. I'm going to just go to screen sharing. My prepared remarks are about 35 minutes or so, but and that we'll have enough time, I'm sure, for a discussion, which I'm very looking forward to. All right. So this presentation interrogates a historical contradiction specific to climate justice and energy system change politics in the nation-state of Canada. This contradiction has to do with the state and its racial capitalist colonial history and its contemporary imperialist interstate topology. Whether or not the terminology of the Green New Deal is referenced, entangled debates continue between neo-Keynesian and eco-socialist ideological programs on the one hand, and between degrowth and eco-modernist variants of eco-socialism on the other. Degrowth theory identifies a link between capitalism's relentless pursuit of economic growth and accelerating social metabolism. Jason Moore's World Ecology explains this historical fate in terms of racial capitalism's competition-driven falling rate of profit tendency and its market discipline chase after productivity. This sends the system down an incessant and recurrent slippery slope into a vortex of accumulation by social metabolic acceleration, through which ever more commodity frontiers are opened, valorized, and exhausted over the long durée of racial capitalism's multiple colonialisms. For these reasons, well appreciated by some political ecologists at least, no humane or just transition to a low-carbon, nuclear-free energy mix is therefore possible without the decommodification of energy systems and some kind of deeply democratic, needs-based rationing of energy consumption, for which some institutional framework of public planning is required, so that energy distribution is not primarily determined by the capacity for some to pay for it. Moreover, what holds for energy holds for a range of essential goods and services such as food, healthcare, housing, transportation, and an ever widening range of care services and care-based cultural luxuries, broadly understood. Contemporary Green New Deal political imaginaries owe their appeal and urgency to these spectral lessons of socialist politics as discovered by social struggles against commodity-mediated immiseration over the 19th century. This is certainly the case with Green New Deal politics in the nation-state of Canada, as pursued by several climate justice organizations, which thereby also confront not only a settler colonial state, but also a neocolonial one in the context of a remarkable cultural political movement of Indigenous resurgence. And it is this complexity I want to focus on in this talk. In brief, the story I have here to tell and interrogate goes something like this. While the climate justice movement in Canada is animated by a political ideological fantasy wherein Indigenous grassroots political organization and militancy is a prominent prop in our national emergency response to climate change, Indigenous decolonization and resurgence politics speak a different political language entirely. While they are not unsympathetic to the anxieties and dreams of the climate justice movement, they remain wary and maintain their distance from them and insist on their autonomous domain of politics. If climate justice politics is to escape its containment by various climate action projects of green and red-washing passive revolution, as Gramsci named the politics of reformist reforms, then we need a deeper understanding of the historical contradictions that situate us in our contemporary dilemmas. Here I need to note at the outset that unlike the case of the EU, where there exists a substantially worked out policy framework, Green New Deal activism in Canada has opted for a more bottom-up approach, hence the emphasis on now disrupted and discontinued town halls for generating the seeds of policy ideas. While all formal policies ultimately refracted by political imaginaries, the question of Green New Deal imaginaries looms larger in our present context for this reason. Consequently, the focus of my discussion here is on Green New Deal imaginaries and ideologies rather than on policy analysis. Specifically, I will draw, same thing's happened again. Oh, there we go. Specifically, I will draw on two important and influential works of social movement literature in this presentation. Seth Klein's A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency from 2020, argues for the politics of Canada's Pact for a Green New Deal campaign and serves as a public primer for GND ideas. Angela Look and her colleagues' post-pandemic contribution to this genre, The End of This World, Climate Justice in So-Called Canada from 2023, distinguishes itself from other prominent examples of GND discourse by, quote, putting Indigenous rights and sovereignty at the center of what needs to be done to rescue a habitable planet. In contrast with Klein's book and the dominant political imaginary of the climate justice movement, The End of This World is, in my view, a major breakthrough. This talk merely furthers a few steps toward unfolding the implications of the political imaginary it articulates. My own perspective on the issues I will be discussing draws from world ecology, ecofeminist degrowth theory, anti-oppression theory, And more specifically here in this talk, I draw from the tradition of Gramscian conjunctural analysis, perhaps best exemplified by Stuart Hall's approach to cultural studies. I begin then by outlining briefly the contours of GND politics in the nation-state of Canada before turning to a critical consideration of the political imaginaries of a good war and the end of this world in more detail. Canada's, what's happened here? Canada's Pact for, here we go. Canada's Pact for the Green New Deal was launched on May 6, 2019, bringing together over 100 environmental justice activist groups, labor unions, city councils, neighborhood organizations, faith groups, feminist organizations that convened over 150 town halls across Canada, involving over 50,000 people until the pandemic disrupted these activities. This pact affirms the full phase-out of fossil fuels by 2040, with transition support for workers, the implementation of UNDRIP in Canada, robust regeneration of the public sector, along with a wide range of social justice demands. While eco-socialists in Canada have been discussing Green New Deal policies since the early 1990s, this latest mobilization of GND ideas reignited with the launch of the LEAP Manifesto in 2015. With the involvement of renowned Canadian activists, journalists, and filmmakers Naomi Klein and Avi Lewis, the LEAP movement sparked a number of other GND campaigns in Canada, such as the Canadian 350.org's Our Time campaign, some aspects of the election platforms of the Social Democratic New Democratic Party of Canada, the Green Party of Canada, and the Courage Coalition's A Green New Deal of the North. Of all these Green New Deals, only the Courage Coalition, claiming their political vision, was an eco-socialist one. The Canadian Greens went into the 2021 federal election, however, with the vaguest of platforms and imploded so that the party's future is now in doubt. Avi Lewis ran for the NDP in that election, championing the platform of Canada's Pact for a Green New Deal, while the party leadership held it at a distance. But Lewis failed to win a seat in the new parliament. If the rising tide of a multitude of different forms of climate justice protest and transformative activism spurred hope, at least in North America, that a politics calling for a state leadership and planning for taking real, concrete climate action was at hand, recent elections in both the US and Canada have rudely dashed them. But there was something remarkably futile, if not abject, about the Pact's primary objective. We'll bring our shared vision of a Green New Deal to political leaders and challenge them to adopt these visionary policies in their platforms, they claimed. The capitalist state took up the challenge and did what it does, did it not? The federal election of 2021, it will be said, was overdetermined by the pandemic. Should the Pact campaign hold its course or change its strategy, if not its politics? In taking up this question, I begin with a few observations about Klein's version of a GND imaginary first. Klein's book was written in the wake of the effervescence of several seeming political advances against the Canadian petrostate and against what sociologist Bill Carroll calls Canada's fossil regime of obstruction. In the fall of 2015, the Trudeau Liberals won a federal election, ending more than a decade of rule by the Harper Conservatives, a government which had rolled back Canadian environmental protection legislation and had adopted a militarized law and order approach to Indigenous land defense during the commodities boom, and had branded the expansion of bitumen mining as Canada's bid to become an energy superpower. Earlier that spring, a somewhat left-of-center, Rachel Notley-led New Democratic Party had just ended 44 years of conservative majority governments in the oil-producing province of Alberta, home to the tar sands. During the election campaign, the Notley NDP were full of green promises and announced a phase-out of coal-powered electricity generation shortly after forming the government. In the context of persistent barricades, compelling testimony at review board public hearings, and an unfavorable federal court of appeal decision, the newly elected Trudeau Liberal government canceled the Northern Gateway Pipeline project in 2016. The Trans Mountain Pipeline project was by then facing similar opposition. South of the border, Obama had just canceled the Keystone XL pipeline. The Sunrise Movement and protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline was at a high tide, while the DSA and the US Greens offered Americans avowedly eco-socialist platforms, and Bernie Sanders' run at nomination at the Democratic National Convention also painted itself in vivid transition green. Thus, hope and expectation throughout the main tributaries of the Canadian climate justice movement was at a historical high watermark. With an eye on expected federal elections in 2021, Klein's A Good War sought to channel this effervescence into effective electoral political agency. The story Klein tells draws upon the essential genre conventions of a GND political imaginary, where the state leads the way through an emergency by establishing a large strategic cluster of crown corporations and invests in green technologies and creates jobs through public finance in a way that meets IPCC targets. Even though the policies aimed at job creation, the reboot of public social programs withered by austerity, are drawn from a socialist historical repertoire of public institutional agency, the core of Klein's vision is, as he put it, quote, a product of both socialism and capitalism, not purely public or private, but planned, close quote. The conceit here of Klein's can-do narrative is to retell a story of Canadian wartime mobilization during the Second World War as a prolepsis for possibilities in the present. This narrative strategy enables Klein to draw on specific historical examples of the state in action in order to dissolve decades of neoliberal taboos in an acid bath of public history. But this activist state is a curious museum exhibit stolen from the world and posed in its own glass box. The late neocolonial global organization of the world economy by corporations, international financial institutions, the US military, and the global system of nation states all get marginal attention in his argument, invoked only as a matter of more foreign aid. He does not broach the issue of climate or ecological debt at all. Klein, however, frames the deeper challenges of telling his GND story this way, quote, will the transition need to be top-down like it was in the war, or can we embrace models of collective economic planning and organization that are more participatory? This is indeed a challenge given the short time we have, and one marked by an inherent tension. We know this transition needs to be state-led and fast, but can it somehow resist the top-down logic of the state? Nothing about us without us, as the social movement slogan first coined by the disability movement says, close quote. Klein duly notes that his Indigenous activist interlocutors tell him that Indigenous people would be wary of signing up for a good war. Matthew Norris from Lac La Ronge First Nation could not be more blunt. Quote, if the government today tried to impose emergency measures for climate change, I don't think Indigenous communities would be supportive, close quote. Since Indigenous activist Molly Wickham tells him that the Canadian state's tactic for circumventing Indigenous resistance to resource development and land disposition is really a war, Klein makes it seem that Indigenous people are ready to fight his good war. He rationalizes his dilemma as a universal, non-sociopolitical matter of speed. Quote, there is, in truth, he writes, a tension. These frames of war and emergency frequently imply a stronger role for the Canadian state and a centralization of power to expedite needed changes. But such moves risk being at odds with the assertion of Indigenous sovereignty and self-government. And there is an inherent tension with respect to time. On the one hand, undoing the racism in our society and our history of colonialism will take time, but on the other, as we face down the climate emergency, time is the very one thing in very short supply. Though Klein ultimately brushes away these questions in order to affirm his theme of emergency, It is notable that Indigenous elders from Treaty 8, our Just Powers research team interviewed in 2017, speak of many emergencies in their communities, but never use the language of climate emergency. They consistently discuss environmental justice in terms of land-based subsistence, self-determination, and the politics and poetics of treaties. Even though Klein's narrative works hard to open doors through which Indigenous sovereignty movement organizations might enter his political project, it seems very unlikely that they ever will. In contrast, Aluk and her colleagues interrogate the kind of GND imaginary projected by Klein's rhetoric and articulate this imaginary with that of Indigenous decolonization politics. I will here outline 3 key ways the political imaginary offered by the end of this world breaks radically with the dominant GND imaginaries of the climate justice movement in Canada. Contemporary Indigenous land defense and cultural resurgence activism after the Idle No More movement and the Truth and Reconciliation process always references a long-standing Indigenous resistance tradition which remembers the historical treaties ratified between the British Imperial Crown and many, though not all, Indigenous nations in the northern expanse of Turtle Island. The most significant of these historical treaties is the Treaty of Niagara of 1764, concluded by representatives of the British Crown and over 2,000 leaders from at least 24 Indigenous nations. While Inuit and many other Indigenous and Métis nations were not involved in the making of this treaty, its broader significance derives from its ratification of the provisions of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, to which the Canadian nation-state's contemporary constitutional order owes its origin and its legitimacy. This Royal Proclamation declared British imperial supremacy in the northwestern quadrant of the transatlantic system at the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763. As a body of law, the Royal Proclamation sought not only to liquidate the legal and cultural existence of New France, but also to make the fact of empire more palpable to the 13 colonies by constraining the political and economic ambitions of their local governments. Most relevant to our discussion here is the proclamation's necessary recognition of Indigenous inherent sovereign rights of self-governance and title to territory. While the purpose of this recognition of Indigenous sovereignty was to prevent the 13 colonies from purchasing or annexing Indigenous land directly by restricting the right to do so as an imperial right of the Crown, recognition of Indigenous sovereignty nevertheless emerges as a logical, legal necessity of this objective. The proclamation stipulated that land could be acquired for the colonies only through treaty negotiations between the Crown and Indigenous nations, and not by any other means the colonists might attempt on their own. This aspect of the Royal Proclamation of 1763 sought to pacify the frontier violence unleashed by the meaningless practice of purchasing land from Indigenous people, which was an utterly nonsensical transaction rife with frauds and abuses, as it was described at the time, since land was neither commodified nor a form of capitalist property in the Indigenous commons. But the proclamation was demonstrated to be inadequate emphatically and dramatically by Pontiac's rebellion of 1763-1766 against the colony's efforts at annexation, so that the subsequent Quebec Act of 1774 clarified that Indigenous territory extended to the earlier boundaries of New France and specifically included the Great Lakes region as far southwest as the Ohio Valley. This recognition of Indigenous sovereignty was one of the crucial provocations of the American Revolution of 1776. Anishinaabe legal scholar John Borrows provides an important explanation of the poetics and politics through which the Treaty of Niagara communicates to us now. The reading out of the terms of the Royal Proclamation was accompanied by speeches from both sides promising peace and mutual respect, as well as the exchange of 2 sets of wampum belts, which are legal texts in themselves. According to Borrows, one of the wampum belts given to the British, the Gus Wen Ta, or 2-row wampum is comprised of 2 rows of purple wampum beads separated by 3 rows of wampum, all in a background field of white wampum. The 2 rows of purple wampum designate the autonomous sovereignties of Indigenous peoples and the Crown, while the 3 rows of wampum between them symbolize peace, friendship, and respect, and the white bed of wampum signifies the purity of the agreement. Burroughs argues that the, quote, 2-row wampum belt illustrates a First Nation Crown relationship founded in peace, friendship, and respect. Neither nation will interfere with the internal affairs of the other. The belt contemplates interaction and sharing between First Nations and the Crown, but it also envisions separation and autonomy between 2 governments, close quote. The second belt Indigenous leaders presented to the British is comprised of hieroglyphs representing Indigenous territory, the British Crown's ship of state, the 24 Indigenous nations all pulling on cables together. Burroughs here remarks, quote, the principles founded in this belt similarly envision a political relationship that incorporates autonomy and integration. The Indians and Crown are clearly separate from one another, yet they are connected in important physical ways. The offer of mutual support and assistance, the cable can be pulled from either end. That also respects the independent nature of each party, and this is a powerful archetype for Canada's federal relationships, close quote. The Canadian Constitution Act of 1982, in its Section 53, recognition and affirmation of existing Aboriginal and treaty rights, also derives from just this historical tradition. But the Canadian state's contemporary comprehensive land claims process cynically seeks to extinguish its own grounds for legitimacy. What is crucial to understand regarding this, regarding the contemporary neocolonialism of the Canadian nation state is precisely this cynicism. Now legally forbidden to ignore this historical tradition of treaties as it has always done ever since Confederation until the Supreme Court of Canada's Calder decision of 1973 forced the issue onto the constitutional agenda. The neocolonial state, nation state, nonetheless continues to ignore this tradition by seeking to conclude so-called modern treaties, which are not treaties at all, but are rather land claim settlements agreements through which Indigenous sovereignty is extinguished in exchange for cash and the delegation of Indian Act obligations to Indigenous municipal governments. Drawing from a robust archive of critical research by Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars, Lelouch and her colleagues outline the range of strategies and tactics through which the neocolonial state, itself a satellite in the collective imperialism of the US global empire, organizes the frontier conditions of possibility of resource extraction from bitumen, conventional oil and gas, critical and other minerals, biomass, all on behalf of resource capital, both green and fossil, both national and foreign. These include the comprehensive land claim settlements, impact benefit sharing agreements, and the theatrics of the constitutional duty to consult, taking the form of public hearings and royal commissions, but also the criminalization of civil protest, the militarization of critical infrastructure, and the liberal use of court injunctions to push resource development through in the face of determined Indigenous blockades and civil protest. What we behold here then is truly a fantastical, constitutionally self-limiting form of colonialism, a rule of law colonialism, or a historical contradiction that takes the form of hegemony without hegemony, wherein the systemic interlocking oppressions of racial capitalism operate through a nomos of individualized rights. By referring us to this tradition of the historical treaties and their cynical disavowal, Lelouch and her colleagues point us then toward a very different emergency than does Klein, which here takes the form of the urgency of a constitutional convention. However, the climate justice movement, the Canadian climate justice movement's understanding of decolonization at the moment proceeds no further than the question of ratifying UNDRIP, which the Canadian state has finally now done, and the inclusion of the principle of free and prior informed consent in natural resource development legislation, which the Canadian state still refuses to do. But the main observation I want to make about this important aspect of the argument of the end of this world here is this. Given the play of political forces on the ground, if a constitutional convention was to be held in the near future, we would likely end up with a more retrograde and oppressive constitution than we have now, given the prospects of elections in North America on the horizon, and as has been the recent Chilean experience. This historical contradiction of hegemony without hegemony also animates the end of this world's second most important rupture with the Canadian climate justice movement's GND political imaginary. Unlike Klein, who ignores these issues completely, Aluk and her colleagues not only identify their political program explicitly as an eco-socialist politics, but argue for a political economy that puts, quote, Indigenous economics, laws, and social systems of care at the center of their Cree vision of socialism derived from the Wakatoan law, which they name as Mi'kmaq, and Aluk translates the significance of Mi'kmaq teaching in relation to a series of concentric circles of caretaking and caregiving in common being. Mi'kmaq, Scatowin, Manasitawin, which all connects the physical and emotional care of each singular being to the public and universal provisioning of decommodified care services, public luxuries, and collective ethico-political, social metabolic good relations. In arguing for the revaluation and recentering of disalienated, meaningful provisioning of care in socio-ecological reproduction and in the production of common wealth, not only does Aluk echo subsistence perspective ecofeminism's program for a political economy that sustains life and conviviality directly, but also argues for a decolonizing mode of degrowth. One way to make space for Indigenous care economies to flourish, they write, is to dissolve the systems that have been preventing them from being enacted more widely, naming here the sectors of the death economy producing repression, incarceration, war, as well as commodity-mediated social metabolic acceleration. Here we are once more at the heart of our conjuncture's historical contradiction. I consequently underscore that the force of their argument cuts in both ways. Quote, working to restore Pima Tisiwin, they contend, will destroy a capitalist colonial economy that is based on a death drive for Indigenous peoples and restore ethical Indigenous economies that are adapted to our present realities. If this is so, then land back, cash back, and decolonization itself, the reconciliation of Indigenous and Canadian constitutional orders in accordance with the poetics and politics of our historical treaties, is contingent upon the abolition of interlocking oppressions, and so upon a feminist, eco-socialist transformation of the Canadian nation-state, as decolonization cannot take place within the framework of green and red-washed racial capitalism. If this aspect of Aluk's argument places the ball in the court of settler colonial society to rise to the challenges before it, then the third radical break the end of this world makes with the LEAP manifesto-derived GND political imaginaries involves the lessons the book draws not only from the author's personal experiences as activists, but especially from Indigenous resurgence cultural politics. With deep histories in Indigenous resistance to colonialism, the cultural politics of resurgence has gained new momentum in the wake of the Idle No More movement against commodity boom-driven resource extraction, the subsequent mobilization around the missing and murdered Indigenous women campaign for justice, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Residential Schools. As Leanne Simpson observes, the multifaceted revitalization of Indigenous theories, ceremonies, cultures, political economies, and political ecologies, quote, in no way dilutes Indigenous aspirations for freedom and self-determination, but has always provided a just process for continued reconciliation of our constitutional orders with that of Canada's. It is a principled and radically different way of being, one that compels us to act against the forces that attempt to assimilate us into the fabric of Canadian society." Close quote. In this regard, resurgence politics not only resists anti-Indigenous racism and state resource development by the hegemony without hegemony of constitutionally self-limiting colonialism, but seeks to keep open an autonomous domain of subaltern politics in the context of an Indigenous patriarchal crypto-state apparatus the Canadian state has been constitutionally forced to construct ever since the Calder decision of 1973. As noted earlier, the Calder decision recognized the tradition of the historical treaties dating from the Royal Proclamation and made it impossible for the Government of Canada to unilaterally extinguish them. Consequently, the colonial state has built piecemeal over the years an Indigenous crypto state, as destitute as any debt trap eviscerated state in the global South, and constitutionally fated to sit at the table to hear out the endless monologue of the Government of Canada's duty to consult Indigenous peoples in order to pave the way for the development of each new commodity frontier. The politics of resurgence is therefore also a refusal of this post-political dead end in the project of self-determination. Hence the slogan of resurgence poetics, decolonization, not reconciliation. The end of this world's invocation of resurgence treaty poetics and politics consequently holds three implications for the climate justice movement's GND political imaginary. One that they argue explicitly, along with two others I will underscore in conclusion. One of the set tropes of GND discourse, especially its transition variant, is the promise of good unionized green jobs rising from the horizon. Indeed, in Canada, we are now going through a period of heightened labor union militancy, as in the US, involving not only strike action, but also efforts to organize workers in precarious and new immigrant feminized workforces, long ignored by the big private and public sector unions. In this context, the end of this world advocates for bargaining for the common good, unionism, over the narrow wage and workplace-specific union professionalism the labor movement has inherited from the era of the post-war labor accords. This vision of a mass movement-oriented unionism connects with the resurgence politics-inspired discussion of movement infrastructure, including the social economy long shunned by organized labor. They also voice sharp skepticism of the capacity of either the Canadian Greens or the Social Democratic NDP to be able to represent the Indigenous-led mass movement their manifesto seeks to invoke into being. In doing so, the end of this world pushes the Canadian climate justice movement to confront the literal meaning of its title and face up to the fact that the late imperial historical conjuncture that made social democracy possible has now completely exhausted itself. As the Cold War superpower that once sought to make the world safe for democracy through the security of capitalism, now for the security of capitalism, cannot safeguard its own democracy, we who live on a moon of Jupiter can no longer count on the global institutions of imperialism to care for us, including the interstate system presided over by Pax Americana. Worse still, Gramsci's analysis of the emergent conjuncture of his era teaches us that green passive revolution leads inexorably to the rising tide of fascism redux. Not surprisingly, the most under-theorized aspect of the end of this world is its fleeting discussion of ecological debt and North-South apartheid, sharing this northern-centric provincialism in common with most other tracts in this genre. Here too, however, Indigenous Fourth World politics and the poetics of the treaties have much to teach us about how pluriversally autonomous domains of subaltern politics might be able to organize molecular social revolutions capable of undoing the separation of production from social reproduction and abolishing wars against subsistence. But I will leave that story for another day. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sourayan. Yeah. I saw many nodding heads and many applauding hands right now. And I can only echo that. Thank you so much, Sourayan, for this very insightful and perfectly well-informed view on the GND Green New Deal imaginaries that are kind of competing right now in Canada, that where there's friction or tension between them. And I think it's important to really look at these because they shape the room or the space of possibility for socio-ecological transformation politics. So thank you very much for carving out these narratives and imaginaries that are kind of hard to grasp, especially when you are not in this local context. And as we are having an international conversation now, this is super valuable for understanding the Canadian society and perspective at this point. And also, I want to point out again why Sourayan's research and his book that it will be coming out are so important for our research at biomaterialities. And this is because both these things clarify the structures of oppression that play into the efforts for creating bioeconomies. And they tell us why, for example, Indigenous peoples might not be signing up for this good war of the Green New Deal. And this is something that we, of course, have to understand when we try to understand the possibilities of transformation. Well, this being said, this is now the point in our event where we open up the discussion for everyone who wants to join with questions or comments or remarks. And while you might be gathering your thoughts or waiting for when it's your time to join in, I will open up discussion with one or two questions from my side, and I will hand over to everyone as soon as someone wants to join. So there are so many possible things that we could talk about now, and maybe I will start again with one of the aspects that you mentioned later in your talk. You were talking about death economy that is producing repression, incarceration, war, and commodity mediated social metabolic acceleration. And this acceleration used to come from foster capitalism, and now the bioeconomy might also be a field of acceleration because of growing demands for biomass due to this envisioned societal transformation. And can you describe a bit more how this death economy looks like with regards to resource extraction in Alberta, where you're from? So both renewable and non-renewable resource extraction. How can we imagine this kind of economy taking place?
The kind of economy that already is in place.
You're
about. Well, yes. I mean, I guess in terms of sort of an extractivist economy in Alberta, in particular, it's oil and gas, both conventional and bitumen, which is sold mostly to the U.S., but this is for global markets ultimately, kind of thing. And I guess in terms of renewable extraction would really be forestry, insofar as, I mean, renewable is always a tricky word, right? Because like if you think about solar panels and so on, everybody calls them renewable energy, but ultimately they're not, because the solar panels are not renewable and so on and so forth. The materials there. So that's a tricky thing, but I guess you could describe it as a biomaterial economy. We have also, historically, we've had primarily cattle ranching and to a lesser degree grain agriculture. But see, that has all in Canadian context moved in the direction, as in the United States, towards agribusiness, large holdings, and sort of tenant capitalist farming of various kinds. So the family farm is in deep crisis in Canada. They're falling apart. And interestingly, the social and cultural kind of fabric of that historically emerged around family farming is in deep social crisis of all different kinds of problems. And rife with sexism, I might add, in that regard as well, right? So, but what's very interesting is that in terms of really wanting to rethink the question of agriculture, aside from scholars, there's a lot of research that's going on in terms of regenerative agriculture and these kinds of things. It doesn't have the same kind. I mean, there's community gardening that's happening in the Canadian context, but beyond that, there's not any kind of large, like an organized political campaign to reform agriculture. Now, the thing about the forestry industry is that as long as we're in a kind of growth-oriented industry, and whether the forestry is for pulp and paper, which is one big kind of source, and the other one would be other, I guess, fur and so on for housing construction and so on, right? Now, as long as that kind of remains driven by the planned obsolescence and standard growth imperatives, it's not going to be sustainable in various kinds of ways. So I would say that talking about a green biomaterials economy in the Alberta context would be mostly greenwashing. I mean, our university does a lot of that, and there's research projects to make it all more efficient in various kinds of ways. But the larger issue really is the relationship between the commodity form and metabolic acceleration. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I think this helps to understand more the background of these two Green New Deal imaginaries, which are formulated for the whole Canadian context, but it really makes sense to understand it in the Albertan context as well. And yeah, it shows how far away those bottom-up Green New Deal imaginaries, both of them, although they are different, are from real transformations in biomass production. So there seems to be a big divide in terms of practices versus imaginaries there. And yeah, another thing, maybe more of a clarification question or question for you to elaborate, is also something that you mentioned later in your talk about the Indigenous crypto state in Canada. And in this context, you spoke of Canada's duty to consult with Indigenous peoples as a post-political dead end, and also you spoke of a rule of law capitalism. And could you say a bit more about the specific characteristics of the state that you were talking about?
Sure.
What kind of state is that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, one aspect of it has to do with, I mean, it has its roots even before the Calder decision in a certain kind of way, with the establishment of reserves and the establishment of then band councils, and a kind of a political apparatus that's handpicked by officials of the Department of Indian Affairs. And then, this is kind of presented to Indigenous people as well as to other Canadians, that Indigenous people are managing their own affairs because they have elected band councils that are men. The state picks men, historically picked men. I mean, now they may be kind of relaxing on that to a certain extent, but they historically had picked men to be on the band councils and so on. And so you have in Indigenous communities this kind of political bifurcation between the traditional hereditary political leadership, what people often refer to as the hereditary chiefs and so on. Often they are women in Indigenous communities, and this kind of federal government managed band council kind of thing. Now, what happened in the context of, and this was in the context of Indigenous protest against resource development that sort of goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is asked to sort of rule on whether or not Indigenous people have any kind of historical claim to title and so on. And this is the Calder decision that, and I think it's in the context of the Mackenzie Valley pipeline development, and then that this happens. The Calder decision recognizes the tradition of the Royal Proclamation and says that, the Canadian Constitution derives from the Royal Proclamation, and the Royal Proclamation recognizes an inherent allodial sovereignty and title and so on and so forth, right? So what this then means is that this is a separate kind of thing where Canada, up until the 1980s, our so-called constitution was an act of the British Parliament, but in the 1980s, the government of the day repatriated that constitution, and with that repatriation kind of established the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that's our constitution, and that Charter of Rights and Freedoms has a very short sentence, the most shortest sentence you can possibly imagine, that simply says, this document recognizes Indigenous title and treaty rights, Aboriginal rights and treaty rights. And this is what forces then the Canadian government to have to negotiate with Indigenous people for development on unceded land, on land for which there are existing historical treaties, and so on. Now, in order to do that, they're forced by the court to provide Indigenous people resources, to hire expensive lawyers, to maintain files, to all of the kind of stuff that goes with constitutional or like legal court cases and so on, right? So it's over this and over each particular specific site of resistance where Indigenous people have kind of gone to the courts that the Canadian state has been forced to create lines of funding, to create resources, structures of various kinds, things that are like what I've called a crypto state in that regard, that these are, very, very dependent, very, very under-resourced, but recognized formally, legally, formally recognized frameworks of, nation-to-nation negotiation, ultimately, kind of thing, right? And what's happened in terms of the cultural politics of resurgence is this increasing recognition by younger activists, by younger scholars, by many people in Indigenous communities, that is a co-opted kind of dead end that's just spinning in cycles over and over and over again. And so the cultural politics of resurgence really tries to undertake a kind of molecular social revolution, I would call it. That is to say, rebuild Indigenous communities from the ground up, particularly with respect to young people, that young people grow up knowing how to govern themselves in all senses of the word, right? From everyday life to holding political responsibilities within Indigenous traditions of political leadership in this regard, right? And I think that has a very powerful lesson for the Canadian justice movement, climate justice movement, because our reflex is always to go to the state or to go to some form of authority and say, give us this, please, right? Go to the COP sessions and say, solve this for us, please, kind of thing. I'll stop here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for elaborating on this. This really helped me to understand what practices this Green New Deal imaginary that also draws from the Cree tradition comes from, and how difficult it is to maintain those practices in this nation to nation or crypto state kind of situation. So thank you for your answer. And I also saw that two of my colleagues wanted to pitch in, and Johannes, you please go on. You may start.
Okay, thank you. I also have a clarification question regarding your use of the term racial capitalism, because my understanding is that, or the way that I know it mostly is from a US context where it usually talks about Black people or other people of color, but not First Nations or Native American people. So I'm wondering if you could say a few words about how First Nations are different in how they're, I don't know, subjugated into the capitalist state, maybe also how they're different if you have time and knowledge of the subject between the US and Canada, because I understand that that's also a very different history, and we in the German context may be more familiar with the US context than the Canadian one.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, I guess one aspect of it that I'll say that this is part of what the larger book project this is part of kind of tries to do is to make the case that racial capitalism is, I mean, it's certainly not just a US phenomena, but that capitalism is began as a transatlantic mode of wealth production connected with new forms of power and so on. And that in its subsequent kind of transformations, as the transatlantic capitalism becomes global, once the British Empire becomes a British Empire in Asia as well, and then eventually in Africa and so on, that our contemporary global system is a racial capitalist one. And it's a racial capitalist one insofar as a range of different institutional matrices of white supremacy are normalized, and what the social scientific tradition has always called modernity is, in my view, a culture of white supremacy. It's all about passing for white in various kinds of ways, right? And if you think about this, on the one hand, very literally in terms of the role of global English over all other languages that exist in the world and so on, and the place that global English holds in this, and the role of global English in the world of business, in the world of science, in the world of technology, the world of law, and so on and so forth, right? You begin to see how a particular new kind of power, that is racism, emerges first as anti-Irish racism. That anti-Irish racism gets reinvented in terms of anti-Indigenous racism, and then you have another new kind of racism that is anti-Black racism, that all emerge over the 17th century in this transatlantic kind of context. And then over the history of imperialism more generally, with the social sciences, and I have to say that sociology plays a lead role here, right? In the late 19th century, translating all of these different forms of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous and anti-Irish racism into all the other kinds of racism that exist around the world, as the British Empire, where the sun never sets kind of thing. So my understanding of racial capitalism is really connected in that kind of way, and I think that the really significant thing about Cedric Robinson's book, Black Marxism, in this regard for me, is that for a long time, and a lot of literature that I admire very greatly and draw from in various kinds of ways, has always taken the model of 19th century class politics, found that to be too narrow, right? And then tried to expand the understanding of class politics to include new forms of subjectivity that are, a wider understanding of proletarianization in that regard, right? Now, what Robinson's book does, in my view, is that it shows us that in the modern context, the context of anti-capitalist struggles, that there were anti-oppression struggles that preceded that historical formation of labor movement struggles, and that we can now begin to read labor movement struggles in relationship to this longer, deeper history of anti-oppression struggles that were the slave revolts, the mutinies on the ships, what historians Marcus Rediker and Peter Landau talk about, the many-headed hydra of revolt of the transatlantic world, and so on, that there is this much bigger tradition of anti-oppression resistance through which allows us to actually do what many people were trying to do with respect to thinking about industrial proletarianized labor and try to think through those models of protest and social transformation. So that would be how I would approach your question about racial capitalism and its importance to me.
Okay, Johannes,
Thanks.
you want to say something to that?
Not, I mean, it makes total sense. I'm just wondering if you're thinking of the economic position of Native American or First Nations, because that's
Sure.
very
Well,
different from
in the
historically.
Canadian, yeah, in the Canadian context, I mean, this is the thing, is that Indigenous people are being dispossessed of their land. That's one aspect of this. They're being dispossessed of their land precisely for valorization, right? Because what they're being dispossessed of land because we're extracting commodities, and engaged in this process of the accumulation of capital through that dispossession. That's one side of it. But Indigenous people, insofar as they're dispossessed of land, are also being proletarianized, and they are, part of the most insecure part of the Canadian labor force in that regard. Jobs that disappear as one resource boom turns into a bust, kind of thing. So they are both part of a traditional working class, but also not part of a traditional working class in that regard.
Thank you, Sourayan, for elaborating on this. It's a really complex question, and I took from your remarks also that there is parallel lines going on. There is this maybe longer tradition of resurgence before resistance to capitalism, resistance to other forms of oppression, but also a different way of going to the back to roots that is more directed not to resurgence but to practices, to this what you call molecular social revolutions that are rooted in some kind of practice or some kind of philosophy. And so it's this double perspective or path that the indigenous or the end of this world imaginary of the Green New Deal is maybe trying to access. Also Miriam has raised her hand. I think she closed her video for technical reasons. Miriam, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, and sorry, that I'm keeping my video off because every time I turn it off, then I had holes in your presentation. But thank you very much for your presentation. I also have a clarification question for a term that you used, which I think is important for your characterization of the Canadian state, and is this term of hegemony without hegemony. So I tried to clarify in my head what that might mean. And you mentioned Gramsci in the beginning. It means something like domination without active consent, but I wasn't able to really fit it into what you said, because I thought, well, there is active consent. In the end of your talk, you had the slide of the truck saying, yeah, we love oil and gas and so on. There seems to be also a lot of consent despite this growing movement of disagreement with this policy. So I was just wondering whether you could elaborate on that, because I have a feeling you repeated it later on. It's important for your characterization of what you're trying to explain.
Sure. I mean, I'm drawing here from the work of Ranajit Guha, who wrote a book about Indian history, where he used the characterization of dominance without hegemony to talk about the nature of colonialism in the Indian context. And his main point there was that the kind of rule of law of the British Empire, that when it was brought to the Indian context, and he was thinking even specifically in terms of the issue of the permanent settlement and kind of revenue extraction from the land and so on, where precisely the kind of universalistic reasoning that the British used in their own domestic context of opposing feudalism, let's say, that they invent a new form of it in the Indian context in order to sort of create a system of revenue extraction in that works within the Islamic system that already existed there, the Jamindari system of land ownership that the British build their empire on top of, right? So what Guho is driving at here is the fact that this idea of Gramsci's of hegemony always needs to be understood in terms of various contradictory forms of domination. I mean, this is the force, sometimes you kind of unpack Gramsci's idea of hegemony as there's an element of force, and then there's an element of securing hearts and minds, but there's always an element of force, and so on and so forth. And what Guho takes aim at is this kind of narrative that is basically a Hegelian narrative that it's not just Hegel, but often people inherit it from Hegel, about the emergence of civil society and the dissolution of kinship and so on into the modern individual who's ready to sign contracts. And this is the beginnings of civil society, and this is the space in which consent then happens through the bourgeois public sphere and so on and so forth. So Guho is kind of thinking about how all of that unfolds in the Indian context as a contradiction, that it's kind of there, but it's also always not there as well. It's also its opposite in some kind of way. So it's dominance without hegemony. So I'm kind of playing with that idea of dominance without hegemony in the Canadian context by calling it hegemony without hegemony, because we all think we live in a world where our consent is being secured and so on, right? But if you think about this more deeply, when do we actually really consent, and to what do we consent, and so on?
Yeah.
Does that help?
Sorry.
Does that help?
No, I just wanted to say thank you. It's hard without this interaction of you seeing me, so I wanted to say thank you.
Yeah. I think this is, Sourayan, your answer was also a great example of how you work with words. It's a wordplay. It's the wordplay accesses a deeper level of social theory, or what you would point out. But yeah, it requires that people join this thought process to really understand this deeper level. So thank you for elaborating on this, and also Miriam, thank you for this question. We have also a hand raised by Philip.
Thank you. I think it actually follows up to your answer before. Just yesterday, I wrote how in India there's an airport being planned on Nicobar Islands, which I think is one of the, I guess you can explain later, but I think one of the places where at least indigenous culture is stronger than most other parts of India. And so, I consider myself like part of a climate movement, and I wouldn't say as a white person climate justice movement. I think it's better than as a activist in the global north, based in Germany in my case. I would say like climate movement. And I find it so hard sometimes, like, what do you do with the information that they're in a country like India, like almost fascist, definitely fascist president like Modi wants to build this airport against indigenous culture? And my question would be like, what would be it's more practical than an academic question. What should like activists in the global north do with like things like this happening, where like the exploitation and the colonial and like, I mean, I think this is a perfect example how I understood your research of like racial capitalism in this case. And how do we deal with that in the global north? What do we do?
Right. Well, I mean, it is of course a very big and complicated question, and part of it is a question of how is it that movements in the north and social justice movements in the north in particular can form meaningful forms of solidarity with social justice movements in the global south. And there are different kinds of examples of this, and I think the environmental justice movement itself has many good examples of this, and so on. In this particular instance, I mean, the kind of anti-fascist movements in India are fairly weak and disorganized in various kinds of ways at the moment, which makes it complicated. But there is a certain kind of opposition to Modi as well, right? And I don't know that the circumstances of the particular airport that you're talking about. I imagine, one of the big things that the Indian state is engaged in, it's entirely in competition with the Chinese Belt and Road kind of system, right? So the Indian state is building hundreds of new smart cities and various kinds of industrial corridors, and it's a race for connectivity in the Bay of Bengal in particular. So I would imagine that the airport has to do with that. And there is growing opposition to those kinds of things because of the immediate kinds of, political ecologists call these ecological distribution conflicts, right? And there are all over the place. And so I think that we have to find ways of making meaningful solidarities in these kinds of circumstances. And we have to look at the histories of the various movements to learn from them about what is the best way forward and so on. My gut feeling is that the Andaman Islanders don't really need this airport, but maybe in some respects they do, who knows? But I don't think they're being, that they're really behind this very much as much as other business interests are.
Okay. Now we took a bit of a detour to India, and let's hear Cornelius, who might bring us back to another context.
Yes. Yeah. Hi. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. I don't have a background in political economy. I'm an STS scholar leaning towards economic sociology, and this is kind of where my question is coming from. I think it's more of an empirical question. So when hearing your talk, my first question was like, are the two books that you use as your empirical material, are they describing the same economies? And then you kind of gave an answer to that question. No, if I understood you correctly, they are not really describing the same economies because, as you said, for example, Alouk and her co-authors analyze indigenous care economies, while Klein neglects such economies in her analysis. And so my question would be, could you elaborate a bit more about the differences between the economies described in the two books in terms of their material foundations? So what is being economized and how does it shape the imaginaries at stake?
Okay. Well, I guess the first thing to say is that both of these books are not works of academic scholarship, at least in the field of economics or even political economy and so on, right? They are very much social movement literature. That is to say, they are polemical, ideological texts. This is why I said that what I'm really discussing here is a question of political imaginaries rather than anything else. And then it becomes very interesting to sort of think about how it is that both of those books imagine what an economy is and what the Canadian economy is and what it's doing and so on. And in a sense, I guess part of what I've been saying is that one of the biggest weaknesses of the Canadian left, if not the climate justice movement, is that as a political movement, it's really forgotten how to understand what an economy is to begin with, kind of thing, and to think it through. And insofar as the Canadian left, and even the Canadian left in terms of its scholarly versions in Canadian university systems and so on that we do, we're still kind of stuck in this post-war Fordist, not Fordist, but we take the social democratic horizon as kind of granted in a certain kind of way. Nobody wants the Soviet system. Everybody appreciates a constitutionally limited form of government and elections and these kinds of things. And so the left is thinking within the framework of a set of political institutions that were rebuilt out of the ashes of the Second World War, really, in many kinds of ways, right? And it seems to me, in that regard, and I'm coming up from this from a theoretical point of view that draws much more on world systems, a theory, world ecology, historical sociology of various stripes, and so on. That system of power is in itself in deep crisis now, as is the system of accumulation itself in that regard. Like even these green capitalist kind of dreams that everybody has, it's completely up in the air whether any of them will be able to accumulate anything, or just cause even more chaos and mayhem and so on in the world. So I don't know if this really answers your question or not, but I there's not that much interesting about the economy in either of these books, I would say, from a kind of political economy point of view in that regard.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Most of it's very hopeful,
Yeah. Thanks. That was very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I have two more questions, and one touches a bit on what Cornelius just asked. So maybe we can, Sourayan, we will kind of push you to give up more answers on the economy. But also Miriam raised her hand, and we will hear Miriam first.
If you want to ask your question first, because it speaks directly to that, go ahead, Anna.
No, I think I have another thing in mind, another order thing.
Okay, sure. Then I guess I'll go on. Yeah, my question is related to, well, maybe I should say right now, I'm actually located in Mexico, which is also where I'm from. And your talk about the Indigenous context in Canada made me honestly think about the Indigenous context and struggles for autonomy, and also, yeah, for justice in general, a lot of them related to what is here called a defense of the territory, which is more global. Indigenous struggles here usually don't necessarily talk about the struggle for a particular resource or so on, or maybe climate justice, but this idea of the territory is very important. And it reminded me of the things that you touched on regarding the relationship between these old treaties and things that have been enshrined into law a long time ago that are now being used also as a way of struggling nowadays. This really interesting relationship between law and politics. I mean, politics understood as a given correlation of forces at a given point in time, and this law that happened a long time ago, because also in Mexico, I see that a lot of indigenous struggles appeal to those things that happened a long time ago, but they're very important. And they really, give access to resources or maintain in a context in where there is so much dispossession. Then they tend to be very important. But it's it's not really a question that I have, but it's just an interesting observation of what this resource of the law can be in a context like that you can actually hang on to those things in a context where actually you have little power or little hegemony to go against these things. And it's just an interesting observation for me to see that in Canada, it was being used in a similar way.
Yeah, and I guess Indigenous politics, not just in Canada, but in many, many places, for example, have long gone to the United Nations, sort of to go beyond the nation state for a kind of platform and a place from which they can argue on legal grounds and on moral grounds in various kinds of ways, right? This has been a major dimension of Indigenous defense of their territories in that regard. And yes, it is very much an important resource in that regard, but it also has, I guess, not just in Canada, but everywhere else as well, very immediate dimension to it as well, because if there's always this question of, okay, development of some kind of dispossession of harms of various kinds. So a very kind of immediate, concrete demand for justice involves the local courts, involves questions of what can be done in the form of restitution, in the form of something as immediate as in the case of toxic spills and so on, where people need hospitalization. So how's that going to be organized and so on, right? So I think that the law really is all over the place in that regard in terms of politics, right?
All right, I have two more questions, and one is more of a methodological nature. So listening to your talk, it becomes clear that that you pay a lot of attention to contradictions, and I know from our previous conversations that you even follow something that you call thinking through contradictions. And we kind of now saw it apply to the Canadian case. So if we would want to work with this approach in another case, what would you recommend scholars or social movement actors? How can they use this thinking through contradictions when approaching their problems?
I guess one aspect of it I would say is that the more closely and thickly you describe social reality, the more likely you'll be confronting a range of contradictions, because they are ultimately historical in that regard. And your problem is always then of how do you represent contradictions when they're embodied, when they're unfold in space, when they're endure in time, when they're effective, and so on, when they're not reducible to some kind of logical structure in that regard, right? So this always creates a kind of representational problem, which I find in that regard that this is to face up to that representational problem is a key way of, in that respect, navigating the wreckage of a colonizer's model of the world, where everything is organized in terms of binary oppositions. And social scientists in particular rarely pay attention to the language and the media through which they apprehend reality in various kinds of ways. So it forces us back to think about those kinds of things. It really forces us to take the poetics of social knowledge, of social critique very seriously, I would say. And this is the part of my work that connects most directly with research creation as a kind of research strategy in that regard, right? But contradictions, I mean, the Frankfurt School, Benjamin in particular, had always kind of urged us to sort of get ourselves lost in the materiality of the world. And, instead of applying various kinds of logical schema to it, is that an immanent critique pulls it out of the materials that you're immersed in that kind of way. So how do we do that? Because we're always coming into any kind of research project that we're doing, any aspect of the social, we're always coming to it with a set of categories in mind, right? With a set of categories that we have to use to communicate and so on. So it's really then a question of looking at how those categories are adequate or not adequate, and how they fall apart as we try to describe and explain and interpret. And these three things are all codependent upon one another. You can't do any of them without doing the other ones in that regard. That would be the closest I would come to, turning any of this into a kind of methodological statement, because ultimately we're not baking cakes. There's no recipe here. So you have to invent the recipe each time you're asking a particular kind of question, I would say.
Yeah, thanks. This is great advice. And yeah, thank you for getting close to that, because if we are scholars or students of this material, then of course it's good to have sort of a template and then knowing when to depart from it. Mm-hmm. And yeah, my last question would be, again, something that connects back to the bioeconomy and to our research on biomass production and so on. So one answer that you gave about the socio-ecological transformation of Canadian society and political economy that you were drawing from the second book was to restore Indigenous economies that are not the same, but that are adapted. And yeah, is there something that we can take from Alok's work or from the other research that you know? What might this mean, or how might this look like with regard to biomass production, this restoring of Indigenous communities, economies?
Well, I mean, my sense of it would be that, and there is like the Land Back report, there's the Yellowhead Institute located, based at the University of Manitoba, that have put out a series of reports that are very, very influential in terms of Indigenous politics. I think I had a slide of one of them of the Land Back report, but there's been a few others. These are short reports, but they kind of give you a sense of, for example, Indigenous land stewardship traditions that have existed for a long time, and that are being revitalized in the present context within Indigenous territories, on reserves and elsewhere. And I mean, one of the things that is clear about all of these are forms of commons, right? This is commoning. In fact, that whole kind of theory and practice of commoning, Eleanor Ostrom's work and so on. I mean, commoning in that regard has always been how traditional subsistence and agricultural people have related to their environments in that regard. There's always a system of law involved in that regard, right? So I think that this is one aspect of it, that this is not the production of biomaterials of various kinds cannot take the form of capitalist property, but has to be organized in some other kind of way, involving forms of public ownership in relationship to common property ownership and so on. And this would be one of the ways in which Indigenous self-governance, I think, could viably work in that regard, as people managing different commons. And there's, Europe itself is a very interesting set of experiments in terms of people doing with commons and public common partnerships and so on. Maybe those are things where are ways that enable us to sort of think through new institutional forms. But the key issue politically and theoretically, I would say, is somehow rather delinking from the so-called law of the commodity form of value to something that's, you could call a care form of value that's doesn't fall into the same social metabolic acceleration trap kind of thing.
This is great. I had to write this down. Care form of values, stewardship traditions and commoning, and depart from the commodity form. Yeah, if this is what we can, or I think what we can draw from Indigenous traditions and their these kind of imaginaries, you already translated it into political economic language. Thank you for doing that. I can understand that as a political economist. And yeah, maybe to find an endpoint to the conversation, I would like to point to something that we saw on your slides, which I actually really liked very much. They were very illustrative of what you said. And there was this one poster that said, "Is Western science finally catching up to Indigenous knowledge?" So if we take this question and translate it for the bioeconomy research project that we're in, we need to ask, is the bioeconomy finally catching up to Indigenous knowledge? Well, it certainly is not at all, at least not in the policy documents that we see that are state issued from the German government, not really. But are there any wider visions, like Green New Deal imaginaries, that could actually pave the way to incorporate these kind of knowledges? This is the question that we can ask, that is not too far-fetched, because bioeconomy policies and documents are kind of very far-fetched if we put those into comparison with Indigenous knowledges. But yeah, there's a huge gap, and we need to find ways to bridge that. Let me check out okay. Good. So thank you all for being here. And please keep in mind that Sourayan's book, Interlocking Racisms, Multiple Colonialisms, Accumulated Violence, and Degrowth Plenitude will come out at some point. Yes.
I finished writing it.
Oh yeah, you're finishing writing it?
No, when I finish writing it.
Oh yeah, okay. I guess you will. And yeah, I definitely look forward to that. And thank you very much for agreeing to have this conversation with us today. It was very inspiring, very enlightening with regards to the Canadian context, but also much more with regards to all these questions of interlocking oppressions and racial capitalism. And this is really something that we need to understand in more detail if we want our greener, sustainable societal politics to be informed by that. Then we first have to make ourselves acquainted with it. And thank you for helping us with this very big task. And yeah, this was now an event in this public lecture series hosted by Biomaterialities, the research group. We have more public lectures coming up. We already had public lectures going on, and you can all find them on our YouTube channel. And you can check out our work on biomaterialities.de. Maybe Till you can put those two things in the chat, the link to the YouTube channel and also to our website, in case people want to follow up on this conversation. And we would love to getting in touch in the future. So thanks again, Sourayan, and thank you everyone for participating in the discussion. And
yes,
yeah, have a nice
I do want to thank everybody here for coming and listening to this talk and so on. I'm very grateful for your attention, and I very much enjoyed our discussion and your questions and so on. And I wish you all the very best with your research and future endeavors. But thank you very much for attending to this.
Thank you, Sourayan.